This is lecture 61A that accompanies the fourth volume in the series, The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018. That fourth volume called Communism in Oceania, and in that volume it's chapter 64 that this supplements. And I want to begin today with this discussion of the exception that proves the general theory as a kind of prologue to our discussion of primitive communism in New Guinea. What we have learned is that it is not simply technological advance that determines the course of history. The tri-component advance of culture determines that course. In other words, technology, social organization, and ideology, or in classical Marxist terms, the forces of production, the relations of production, that we call the mode of production, when taken as a base, upon which arises the social superstructure. Now, furthermore, one law of dialectical materialism is that exceptions must always prove the rule. In the case of Oceania, we have an excellent example of this law of philosophical matter of work. And again, remember that philosophical matter refers to everything: non-living physical matter, living biological matter, and cultural matter. It is our philosophical theory of everything. Now, hunting and gathering primitive communism advanced through the phases of broad spectrum wild resource exploitation to agricultural revolution, and then through the transitional chiefdom stages to the servitude epoch. We are currently transitioning from the servitude epoch to the socio-cultural stage of modern communism. The latter is the first stage of the era of freedom, meaning the transition from the era of necessity. The era of necessity encompasses everything up and until communism, meaning that what people do is determined by their necessary need to satisfy the fundamentals of life. Once people are freed from that necessity and have a Star Trek level of technology, they are in the era of freedom. In Oceania, we see the movement from primitive communism of hunting, gathering, and agricultural tribes in the large island of New Guinea and the continental mass of Australia into simple chiefdoms, and some of these become advanced theocratic chiefdoms. The simple and ATC chiefdoms spread dramatically throughout the South Pacific Seas at that point. Now, the fact that they were not lands the fact that they were not land-bound agriculturalists, but spread for the same reasons as the peoples of nuclear China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mesoamerica, and the Central Andes, is the exception that proves the Marxist general theory. Chiefdoms of the simple stage variety spread into new lands where the rubes could slash and burn forever and retain their egalitarian and altruistic lifestyles. Where perceived de facto differences in reward for the professional specialists got the upper hand, and advance to ATC stage chiefdoms was inevitable, and oceanic societies moved into hostile environments precisely to reinforce the rank differences. The upper ranks were on the road to becoming property deed owning classes, but in chiefdoms without the state apparatus, that is, army and police, in the hands of the well-to-do, another solution always imposes itself, and that is religion. Religion in the hands of the first professional specialists, the priests and priestesses. A religion that preaches the voluntary giving over of authority to the center. Do we see this in Oceania? Yes, yes, and yes. The last stage of primitive communism is that of the agricultural bands and/or tribes. The next and transitional stage to the servitude epoch is that of the simple chiefdom. It evolves as a product of the professional specialization of labor within the constraints of egalitarian Chionist rule. That is, societies where, within the farm or equivalent family protective unit, the more hands there are, the fewer hours they all work, and conversely, the fewer hands there are, the more hours they work. In some simple chiefdoms, the egalitarian lifestyle is challenged by the rise of non-altruistic thinking among some or all members of the chiefdom. This happened in New Guinea and in Australia, and those that desire more for themselves will advocate moving into more challenging environments because that is precisely what will require more professionalization, not less. As it does, the role of the center in administering the redistribution of social product becomes increasingly important and easily recognized by the rubes as such. At first, a unifying religion will impose ideological clarity upon the chiefdom members, and this happened in Micronesia, Australia, Polynesia, and Melanesia. Now, given some of these oceanic ATCs evolved into primitive class-divided and state-organized kingdoms, as we see in the Hawaiian Islands, and earlier in Lower Polynesia, and for that matter in parts of Melanesia. It was not agriculture or even irrigation agriculture that created class society in the state. Class society arising within the ATCs by one route or another gave armed force to the ruling classes. Again, we have the dialectical materialist proof of Marx and Engels to the historical materialist theory of socio-cultural evolution in another part of the world, in Oceania, where animal and plant domestication was only part of the technological component of the mode of production. And we have the unifying megalithic tradition of stone cultures as proof of the ATC status of the upwardly moving social formations. Now we'll begin our discussion of Oceania in Melanesia, in the primitive communism to chiefdoms period in New Guinea. Melanesia is a sub-region of Oceania. It consists of the world's largest tropical island of New Guinea, now the Indonesian province of Irian Jaya, and the independent state of Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, and New Caledonia, a territory of France. And we'll discuss all of these in sequence. So we've already gone through the Irian Jaya part of when we discussed about Indonesia. The name Melanesia was first used by Jules Dumont d'Urville in 1832 to denote an ethnic and geographic grouping of islands whose inhabitants, he thought, were distinct from those of Micronesia and Polynesia. Papua is derived from the Malay word Papua, which means fuzzy hair. Ethnographic and historic New Guinea. The current population of the island of New Guinea is about 11 million. Many believe human habitation on the island dates to as early as 50,000 BP, that is 50,000 years ago, and settlement possibly dating back to 60,000 years ago has also been proposed. The island is presently populated by almost 1,000 different tribal groups and a near equivalent number of separate languages, which makes New Guinea the most linguistically diverse area in the world. Ethnologue's 14th edition lists 826 languages in Papua New Guinea and 257 languages in Irian Jaya, for a total of 1,773 languages on the entire island of New Guinea, with 12 languages overlapping. They fall into two groups, the Papuan languages and the Austronesian languages. The separation was not merely linguistic. Warfare among societies was a factor in the evolution of the men's house, separate housing of groups of adult men from the single-family houses of the women and children, for mutual protection against the other groups. Pig-based trade between the groups and pig-based feasts are a common theme with the other peoples of Southeast Asia and Oceania. Most societies practice agriculture, supplemented by hunting and gathering. The great variety of the island's indigenous populations are frequently assigned to one of two main ethnological divisions, based on archaeological, linguistic, and genetic evidence, and these are the Papuan and Austronesian groups. The great variety of current evidence indicates that the Papuans, who constitute the majority of the island's peoples, are descended from the earliest human inhabitants of New Guinea. These original inhabitants first arrived in New Guinea at a time, either side of the last glacial maximum, approximately 21,000 years ago, when the island was connected to the Australian continent via a land bridge, forming the landmass known as Sahul. These people had made the shortened sea crossing from the islands of Wallacea and Sundaland, the present Malay archipelago, by at least 40,000 years ago, subsequent to the dispersal of peoples from Africa. The ancestral Austronesian peoples are believed to have arrived considerably later, approximately 3,500 years ago, as part of the gradual seafaring migration from Southeast Asia, possibly originating in Taiwan. Austronesian-speaking peoples colonized many of the offshore islands to the north and east of New Guinea, such as New Ireland and New Britain, with settlements also on the coastal fringes of the main island in places. Human habitation of New Guinea over tens of thousands of years has led to a great deal of diversity, which was further increased by the later arrival of the Austronesians, and of course by the more recent history of European and Asian settlement through events like transmigration. About half of the 2.4 million inhabitants of Indonesian Papua are Javanese migrants. Large areas of New Guinea are yet to be explored by scientists and anthropologists. The Indonesian province of West Papua is home to an estimated 44 uncontacted tribal groups. Now, let's take a look at the historical tropical island. In AD 1544, a Spanish explorer called the island Nueva Guinea. After 1884, the western half of New Guinea was Dutch New Guinea, the northeastern section German New Guinea, and the southeastern quarter British New Guinea. In 1905, Australia took over the Dutch territory, renaming it the Territory of Papua. In 1946, the British and German territories were combined and jointly administered by Australia as the Territory of Papua and New Guinea. And in 1975, the country became Papua New Guinea, or that is PNG, or officially the independent state of Papua New Guinea. And we'll refer to it throughout this series as the PNG. Papua New Guinea's environment. Papua New Guinea consists of eastern New Guinea along with New Britain, New Ireland, Bougainville, and 600 small islands and archipelagos. People of my generation will remember that a large part of the turning point of World War II in the Pacific was fought in all of these islands, and you'll be kind of familiar with them. We will get to them, including Guadalcanal, as we proceed through these 4 lectures. The land area is over 178,000 square miles, with the PNG accounting for 80% of it. To the south is Australia. To the east and southeast are the Solomon Islands and other Melanesian countries. North-northwest are the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. The central mountain chain extends the length of the entire tropical island and is covered in tropical rainforest. Upland valleys and the headwaters of fast-flowing rivers descend to the coast through some of the world's largest swamps. Papua New Guinea has a tropical monsoon climate. It is generally hot and humid, although the climate varies from one area to another. Over 75% of the nation is covered in rainforest. Swamp forest is found in the poorly drained lowlands, and sago palm is a staple food of the people living there. Around Port Moresby and in drier areas in the west are grassy plains and savanna woodlands. Now, demography. As for the demography, language, and culture. In the year 2000, the PNG exceeded 5 million in population, growing annually by 2.3%. 85% of the population lived in small villages and rural outposts. 15% was concentrated in 10 major urban areas, where most of the non-Melanesian population of about 25,000 resides. The largest cities are Port Moresby, of 220,000, Lae, that's L-A-E, of 90,000, Madang at 30,000, Mount Hagen at 45,000, Wewak at 23,000, and Goroka at 25,000. Well over 1,000 languages are spoken throughout New Guinea. After colonization, Papua New Guineans communicated with one another and with outsiders in various languages. Now, in German and later Australian plantations, and wherever individuals speaking different languages met, a pidgin language referred to as Neo-Melanesian or Melanesian Pidgin developed. That Melanesian pidgin, known as Tok Pidgin, is spoken throughout Papua New Guinea. English is taught in school and is the official language of business and government. Tok Pidgin is a symbol of national identity and the preferred means of popular communication. Hirimotu, a trade language that originated on the south coast in Papua among participants in a traditional trade network, is spoken in that area. Now, as for Paleolithic primitive communism, archaeological evidence of Papua New Guinea dates back to about 60,000 years ago. These primitive communist inhabitants of Papua New Guinea came from Southeast Asia and occupied New Guinea on their way to Australia after the Sangamon Interglacial, as we call it in North America, and the sea level lowered and distances between islands lessened. Although the first arrivals were hunters and gatherers, early evidence shows that people were broad-spectrum wild resource exploiters who managed the forest environment, providing food. Recent archaeological research suggests that 50,000 years ago, people occupied the highlands at altitudes up to 6,600 feet. Simultaneously, people occupied the warm coastal areas where shellfish and fish were dietary mainstays. The Neolithic Revolution and the stage of tribal agriculture. Cooke Swamp, that's K-U-K, Cooke Swamp is an archaeological site in New Guinea that lies in the Wagi Valley of the highlands. The swamp developed in a former lake basin as it was infilled by an alluvial fan or deposits of water-transported material. Cooke Creek flowed through the fan to a catchment in the lower hills of the south region. People built channels to carry the water past the reach of the fan. When these channels were blocked, the area would develop as a swamp, diverting the water into smaller distributing channels. This evidence for early agricultural drainage systems is dated 9,000 years ago. Features such as pits, post holes, and runnels have been found at the site, indicating evidence of early agriculture. Such features are consistent with planting, digging, and tethering of plants. A number of plants, including taro, were grown at what would have been the edge of its cultivatable limit in the highlands. The ditches are of three types: major disposal channels, second is large field ditches, and three small field ditches. The major disposal channels were built to divert water from the fan flowing south and direct them toward the northeast areas. The large and small field ditches are uniform, surrounding the perimeter of the planting areas. They connect with the major disposal channels. During archaeological excavation of the drainage channels, researchers found artifacts including wooden digging sticks, a grindstone, and other small items. The ditches were cleaned out and a small trench was dug to study the different layers of clay used to construct the ditches. These different layers proved that people deliberately constructed the ditches. Native crops of taro and yam were grown here, and evidence of cultivation of bananas in the form of banana phytoliths and sugarcane remains begins by 6,900 years ago. Since bananas do not produce phytoliths in the same quantity and frequency as grass and other plants, the abundance of banana phytoliths found in a managed grass landscape proves deliberate planting. The bananas grown at Cooke Swamp were Amusa bananas, which developed as the most significant and largest group of banana domesticans. This makes the Cooke Swamp one of the earliest sites in the world for the development of agriculture. The Cooke Early Agricultural Site consists of 148 acres of swamps in the western highlands of New Guinea, nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. Archaeological excavation has revealed the landscape to be one of wetland reclamation worked almost continuously for 10,000 years. It contains well-preserved archaeological remains demonstrating the technological leap of broad-spectrum, wild resource exploiting tribes transformed from collecting to horticulture and then to agriculture by 6,500 years ago. It is also an excellent example of transformation of agricultural practices over time. Agriculture developed from cultivation via draining of the wetlands through the digging of ditches with wooden tools. We know agriculture was independently developed in the New Guinea highlands by 9000 BP. Today's staple sweet potatoes and pigs were later arrival. Then a major migration of Austronesia-speaking peoples came to a coastal region 2500 BP. These people brought their own pottery, pigs, and certain fishing techniques. 300 years ago, the sweet potato entered New Guinea with its far higher crop yields, transforming traditional agriculture. It largely supplanted the previous staple taro and gave rise to a significant increase in population in the highlands. Archaeological investigations have been intensive but have affected only a small portion of the site. Modern farming activities at Cooke remain relatively low-key and do not intrude upon the archaeological features of the site. In Australia, New Guinea, and the neighboring islands in the southwest Pacific, at least as far as the northern Solomons, archaeologists are finding traces of humankind dating back to more than 60,000 years ago. In recent years, archaeologists have learned that the Solomon Islands formed the eastern edge of the inhabited Pacific until the end of the second millennium BC, that is 4,000 years ago. On current evidence, deep sea crossings and colonization of the islands beyond the Solomons started about 3,000 years ago. Lapita ceramic spread. Now, the expansion of human settlement in the Pacific is proven by the rapid spread of the earliest pottery in Oceania, an ornately decorated ware called lapita, after an archaeological site in New Caledonia. What may have encouraged people with lapita pottery to move away from home and risk sailing in deeper waters beyond the Solomons. Improvements in canoe building and navigation were technological enablers, but the probable sociological causal factor would have been the resolution of the internal contradictions of all simple chiefdoms. To repeat what we have been proving throughout these books, the main internal contradiction in a simple chiefdom occurs when increasing professional specialization leads to perceived de facto differential in rewards for these specialties. In the absence of a state apparatus, that is army and police, the only reinforcing mechanism available for people in this transition from primitive communism is religion. Thus, all societies moving onward and upward feature the next socio-cultural stage of advanced theocratic chiefdoms, or ATCs. Furthermore, movement into more hostile regions is usually associated in other parts of the world with a society undergoing rank differentiation and the promotion of a unifying religion. Megaliths and/or monumental architecture are archaeological indicators for the emergence of the ATC stage. The movement of peoples into the Melanesian islands is one proof, and we have stone megaliths of ATC type now in Oceania. The earliest known works of oceanic sculpture are a series of ancient stone figures unearthed in various locations of the island of New Guinea, primarily in the mountainous highlands of the interior. Organic material trapped within a crack in one megalith has been dated to 3500 BP. By 4000 BP in New Guinea, there were newly stabilized coastal lagoons. These reached a level of natural productivity great enough to support major population growth, fueled by wild foods such as fish, shellfish, nuts, and edible starch from the pith of the sago palm. Pamela Swadling and her colleagues at the Papua New Guinea National Museum and the Field Museum's John Terrell's work at Aitape in West Sepik Province prove the increasing abundance of wild foods. The successes of the early Lapita colonists and others in the Pacific was based on a broad spectrum of food resources, some wild and some domesticated, such as yams and taro and pigs and chickens. The advanced theocratic chiefdoms' stone megaliths. The stone sculptures fall into three basic categories: mortars, pestles, and freestanding sculptured figures. The tops of many pestles are adorned with images of human heads, birds, or birds' heads. The mortars display similar anthropomorphic and avian imagery, as well as geometric motifs. Freestanding figures include depictions of humans, birds, and phalluses, as well as what some scholars identify as echidnas, that is, spiny mammals resembling hedgehogs. While the original religious narrative for these stone images remains to be deciphered. They hypothetically represent totemic species or ancestors used in ritual contexts. When found by ethnographic New Guinea peoples, these early stone sculptures were ascribed a supernatural origin and reused in a variety of religious contexts, ranging from fertility rituals to hunting magic and sorcery. The domestication of dogs, pigs, and chickens, along with technological naval advance, fueled Lapita's expansion into the Pacific. We do know that Lapita carriers were not based on subsistence rice cultivation, because rice only made it to the Mariana Islands in western Micronesia shortly before the arrival of the Europeans in the early 1500s. Europeans found Papua New Guinea in AD 1500, and these were the Portuguese and Spanish navigators sailing in the South Pacific. The principal island of Papua New Guinea was discovered around 1526 or 1527 by Don Jorge de Meneses. Although European navigators visited and explored the Papua New Guinea islands for the next 170 years, little was known of the Papua New Guinea inhabitants until the late 1800s. Now, Png Archaeology. Some mortars, pezels, and statues are important as archaeological finds in the prehistory of Papua New Guinea. Then the question becomes, were stone megaliths associated with agriculture in the lowlands and Bismarck archipelago, as well as the New Guinea highlands? In these highlands, stone megaliths are dated to the period 8000 to 3000 BP. In the lowland and islands, mortars and pezels have not been recovered in archaeological excavations, but can be dated by association and relative chronology. They occur in association with Middle Holocene shorelines of the former inland sea in Sepik Ramu, but are absent from the floodplain that formed after 4000 BP. Now, in 1911, Newhouse proposed that the prehistoric stone mortars and pezels found in Papua New Guinea were used to make pounded taro puddings. Looking at their distribution throughout Papua New Guinea, mortars and pezels occur in those areas where taro, rather than bananas, yams, or sago, is the staple, or could have been in the past. They are rarely found in rock shelters. Most come from land suitable for gardening and building houses. Many have been found during the construction of airstrips. Taro cultivation has declined in many parts of the PNG due to taro blight, beetle damage, and the introduction of higher yielding crops. The distribution of these artifacts is a proxy for the location of taro cultivation and human occupation in Png province and elsewhere in Papua New Guinea during the Middle Holocene, which would be around 5,500 years ago. While the distribution of these artifacts provides us with a broad overview of where people were living and their subsistence, the different styles of mortars and pezels and their distribution give us information about social networks. The elaborate forms of mortars and pezels found in Png are comparable to finds from other provinces. Many of these have coastal affinities. This distribution pattern demonstrates those Middle Holocene communities in Png, as elsewhere in the highlands, were linked with the coast. In the initial period, the coast was the Sepik Ramu Inland Sea. Following 4000 BP, when that sea was filled with sediment, the distance between coastal and highland communities increased. And that sediment came from the fact that the lands higher than that were being burned off and turned into agricultural sections, and when it rains, which it does all the time in New Guinea, it tended to sweep all of that sediment that had been held by grasses and downslope into this inland sea. Now, following 4000 BP, when that sea was filled with sediment and the distance between coastal and highland communities increased, thus the continuation of coastal to highlands interaction became dependent on communities that occupied the riverbanks of the southern tributaries that crossed the Sepik Ramu floodplain. Coastal links rather than trans-highlands social networks explain the distribution of mortar, pezzel, and statue finds in the New Guinea highlands. Highlanders participated in a number of interaction spheres that extended inland from the coast. The four largest coast-to-highland interaction spheres extended inland from one, the Sepik Ramu Inland Sea, into the Central Highlands. 2, from the Huon Gulf into the Eastern Highlands. 3, from the Huon Gulf into the Upper Watut. And 4, from the Oro Coast into the highland valleys of Oro and Central provinces. The nature of these spheres largely explains the regional variability found in the distribution of stone mortars, pezels, and statuette figures in the New Guinea highlands, including the general absence of these artifacts in the Melanesia Valley of West Papua. Despite this being the case, some mortar styles are local innovations within the Central Highlands. Enga Province is located south of the former Sepik Ramu Inland Sea. Differences in style distributions indicate that two zones of social networks extended from the former shoreline of the Inland Sea into Enga Province, and one set was aligned by way of the lower Lay Gap to the large agricultural populations living in the Tari Basin, T-A-R-I, whereas the other served the Wagi and its associated valleys, such as the Lay, L-A-I. Smaller networks extended to the south coast. These different networks indicate that there were multiple entry routes for exchanging tangible and intangible products between coast and highlands in the mid-Holocene. Again, that's roughly 5,500 years ago. In other words, the highlands were not isolated from the coast, nor were coastal inhabitants isolated from the highlands at this time. Crops, plumes, ritual practices, songs, and decorations were shared from coast to highlands, or vice versa, along these routes. Now, as I say, agriculture transformed the highlands. The Pleistocene and Holocene paleoenvironmental record documents increasing deforestation by burning in the highland valleys. By 5000 BP, this burning was producing sediment buildup in low-lying areas because of slope wash following clearing and gardening activities. By 7000 to 6000 BP, the lower parts of all the major highland valleys in the PNG were mainly anthropogenic grassland. By the mid or late Holocene, this was also the case for low hill sites and isolated valleys, and by 4000 BP, the inland sea was completely infilled with these sediments. As we have seen, the oldest site with evidence for the cultivation of plants in Papua New Guinea is Cooke, K-U-K, in the western highlands. Taro and bananas planted in gardens at Cooke from 10,000 years ago. The initial garden evidence, which only survives in a wetland context, consists of 2 starch and banana phytoliths, as well as evidence for other crops and features such as garden stake holes. The deposition of sediments in low-lying areas indicates that similar gardening activities were taking place on valley slopes, but features from these gardens have not survived. By 7000 BP, people were making garden mounds in which crops were planted. The oldest gardening tool is a woman's digging stick found near Tambul that dates 4500 BP. Shortly before 4,000 years ago, the first rectangular field systems consisting of networks of garden ditches were in use. The environmental transformation of the inland sea is thus explained. And one wants to constantly remember that there's a tremendous amount of daily rainfall on this tropical island, which tends to wipe out an awful lot of things which would have been there in terms of features, of architectural features of garden and irrigation and so on. Frequency of mortar and pestle finds in Enga. The Enga sample consists of 99 mortars and 34 pestles. The main clusters of mortars and pestles found in Enga province are in the valleys of the Lay River and its tributaries in the east, and the valleys of the lower Lay Gap River and its tributaries in the west. Their original use is unknown. Historical traditions stretching back some 350 years, and eyewitness accounts ethnographically report the discovery of these artifacts while building houses and gardens. Their interpretation as stones or bones of the ancestors, and use in rituals of fertility is, of course, local invention. Originally, they were probably made and used for proper food preparation, feasting and gardening rituals by small-sized horticultural communities living in dispersed hamlets adjacent to their gardens. The distribution of these artifacts in modern times probably approximates the prehistoric one. Weisner was told that clans did not take their sacred stones with them when they migrated to distant areas after being roused by warfare or in pursuit of new and better land. Migrants sought oddly shaped stones and interpreted them as ancestral stones for their new areas of residence. Few mortar and pestle finds have been reported from above 6,500 feet, and all the finds come from areas suitable for taro cultivation. One study by Dr. Clark in 1977 of taro gardening at all elevation shows where cultivation now occurs, people could have supported themselves growing taro in high altitude areas. There, gardeners now cultivate sweet potatoes, but would have had to cope with slower maturation rates and lower yields. When Weisner made a survey of ritual sites in the highland area of the upper Legap River, she found that mortars and pestles were not ritual stones. This low frequency and lack of elaborate mortars and pestles from high altitude areas confirms findings based on oral histories, namely that such areas were formerly inhabited by mobile hunter-gatherer groups and have only been densely settled by agriculturalists since the introduction of the sweet potato, and that latter of the sweet potato was introduced only some 250 to 400 years ago in this area. Although people have long had an impact on the Enga province landscape, the population density remained low until sometime between 1795 and 1825. Historical ethnography indicates that 10,000 to 20,000 people inhabited the major Engan valleys before the introduction of the sweet potato. By the time of the 1980 census, Enga's population was 150,000. And that brings us to a conclusion of our discussion of primitive communism in the island of New Guinea, with a few theoretical comments along the way. Next time we're going to go to the next stage in New Guinea and the other islands of Melanesia, which include the Solomons.